Yes. All right. So, good evening. My name is Reinhold Martin. I'm a faculty member of the Committee on Global Thought. And I teach in the Graduate School of Architecture, Planning, and Preservation. I'm a historian of architecture and indeed urbanism. And I'm very pleased. I really have to say, both moved and honored that Kian has asked me to sort of invite you, all of us, into a conversation about this incredible book. I think probably most of you understand when I say incredible that I mean it in a way that we can't always say about books here or pretty much anywhere else, and especially academic books. I won't give you all the details of the context in which Kian Tajbakhsh wrote this book. But I suspect, first of all, many of you are aware, but also this is a little bit of an invitation, since the book is written, in a sense, in the first person, but in a scholarly mode, to reflect on the interaction of personal historical experience, because that's what we're really talking about, and intellectual work when we do the kind of work that we do. In this case, I suppose we could say the story begins and ends on an airplane. There's a kind of very, very, I mean, to me, just jarring vignette, I think it's in the preface, of leaving Tehran for, at least for the time being, for the last time. Kian's telling his personal story, having been imprisoned under very brutal conditions for political reasons there for many years, and for reasons related to the work. And so it's I'm sort of signaling a little bit that perhaps we can find ways to take this up, this intertwining of the personal and the political, that is in effect the subtext of the work. The context, the larger context, having to do with the nuclear accord with Iran, negotiated by the Obama administration, which effectively, I think maybe we could say, put Kian on that plane back back to New York, right? You came to New York, yeah. And I certainly remember that also, not only for the scenes that took place on the lawn of Butler Library some years before that, in which the president of this university confronted the then president of Iran regarding Kian's imprisonment, but also when Kian arrived in not just my institution here, like Columbia University, but more proximately in the Graduate School of Architecture, Planning, and Preservation, as a member of the urban planning faculty for some years, and then eventually several years later, as a colleague on the Committee on Global Thought, which is the entity officially that brings us here, and in fact allows me to return to the Heyman Center after a prolonged and unplanned hiatus. So we're here to discuss many things, but mostly this book, or the many questions and insights raised by this book, Creating Local Democracy in Iran, State Building and the Politics of Decentralization, by Kian Tajbakhsh. I will just, before then I'll briefly introduce our interlocutors and give you a little bit of a script for how we want to do this. But just before that, I wanted to say that the way I have read the book, that probably in one way or another, we're here to have a conversation somewhere around or moving in and out of these three derivatives of, to speak from the Western tradition, of the Greek kratia, meaning power or rule, that is democracy, technocracy, and theocracy. And so perhaps that gives you some sense of the kind of framework conceptually with which the book deals, and with which perhaps our conversation might kind of work as well. In order to get there, I will just now formally introduce our speakers in order of appearance. First, Kian Tajbakhsh, who holds a PhD from Columbia from this institution in 1993. He will introduce briefly the book itself. From his current position as senior advisor at the Global Centers, Columbia University, and a member of the Committee on Global Thought. In the former role, in the other role of Global Centers, he works on university-wide initiatives focused on global migration, and indeed is the coordinator of the CGT, as we call it, the Committee on Global Thought. He's also a fellow with the committee, and where since 2016 he has taught the core course in the Global Thought MA program called Globalization and the Problems of World Order. And as I mentioned from prior to that, from 26, well, overlapping really with that, right? 2016, 2018, he was professor of urban planning in GSAP here also at Columbia. In addition to this book here, Creating Local Democracy in Iran, Kian is, which was published just this year, very recently, by Cambridge in 2022. He's also the author of another book that I can recommend to you when you have finished reading this one, or you could maybe read them in the other order. The Promise of the City, Space, Identity, and Politics in Contemporary Social Thought from 2001. So in order, we will be joined in so Kian, I'm going to speak for a little bit, introduce the book, and then our respondents will then offer their thoughts. Lisa Anderson is special lecturer and James D. Shotwell Professor of International Relations, and you may know her also as Dean Emerita at the Columbia University School of International and Public Affairs, SIPA, which she led from 1997 to 2007. Dr. Anderson's scholarly research has included work on state formation in the Middle East and North Africa, on regime change and democratization in developing countries, and on social science, academic research, and public policy, both in the United States and around the world. I will not give the full list of publications and so on, but again, I invite you, for all our respondents, but I invite you to read their work closely as well. Dean Anderson will be followed by Irvan Abrahamian, who is an Iranian-American historian of the Middle East. He's a distinguished professor of history at Baruch College and the Graduate Center of the City University of New York, and is widely regarded as one of the leading historians of modern Iran. He's just completed, I guess, as of last year now. Is it out? I should have. Yeah, he completed. Sometimes these things get out of date. Oil Crisis in Iran, From Negotiations to Coup. Again, also in Cambridge, and just out last year, and but now working on a book, yes, on the 1979 revolution. In 2011, he was elected fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences at the Wilson Center. And then finally on screen, my colleague from GSAP, Wei-Ping Wu, who is professor of urban planning and director of the urban planning programs at Columbia GSAP. She indeed served as interim dean of the school during this past spring and summer. But also at Columbia, she's also works very much at large on the faculty of the Weatherhead East Asian Institute, and as a member or faculty affiliated with the Columbia Population Research Center. And I know this very well. Wei-Ping is also an incredible contributor and to the sort of well-being of her own field at large, the field of urban planning. And in this capacity, she's on the Planning Accreditation Board, which I can assure you is not a walk in the park. She's also the editor of the Sage Handbooks of Modern China series, and has provided consultation to the Ford Foundation, Lincoln Institute of Land Policy, and then the World Bank. She's co-author with Piper Gabartz of The Chinese City from 2012, and just like, again, hot off the press, co-editor with Jin Gao of China Urbanizing, Impacts and Transitions from 2022. So clearly a sort of, the right group to engage Kian in conversation about his book. And so with that, I will step aside and allow Kian to sort of more or less begin the ceremony.
Okay, well, Reinhold, thank you very much for that kind introduction, and thank you so much for helping to organize today's panel. I'm going to start with a few acknowledgements, and then I'll make a few comments about the book. First, I would like to express my thanks. You have to excuse me, I lost my voice yesterday, and I'm happy that it's back enough today. I'd like to express my thanks to the team at Cambridge University Press. Maria Marsh, the senior commissioning editor, saw the importance of the topic and welcomed the somewhat unconventional use of the personal and autobiographical elements of the manuscript. Together with Laura Simmons and Atifa Jiwa, now at Bloomsbury, the Cambridge team shepherded the manuscript through the production process smoothly, certainly improving the manuscript on the way. It was a pleasure to work with all of them. I'm delighted to see friends and colleagues in the audience here, some who provided valuable feedback by reading drafts, particularly Professor Bob Beauregard. I extend a thanks to. I'm delighted to be able to call a colleague and a friend going back to when we were both teaching at the New School. I'm grateful to President Lee Bollinger and Professor Carol Gluck, then chair of the Committee on Global Thought, in welcoming me warmly to Columbia when I was exiled from Iran in 2016. The Committee on Global Thought has been and remains a wonderful space for teaching and research. I thank the current chair, Dr. Vishaka Desai, and other CGT colleagues who are here today. Finally, I'm honored to have three distinguished colleagues join me today to discuss my book. I know I have much to learn and look forward to their comments. Finally, I'd like to thank the staff at CGT, Beth Samaya, who's here, and Sophia Somare for organizing this event. Now, I'm not going to go into much detail about the book. This isn't a traditional book talk, but I am eager because I'm eager to engage with the panelists' views. But I will make a few general remarks about the book, which may be of use as we continue the discussion. As has been mentioned, Reinhold mentioned it, and I mentioned it earlier, the book is both a scholarly analysis, but also a very personal book. In almost all the main events and case studies in the book, I was both observer and participant. I went to Iran after a 20-year absence in 1997, initially for family and personal reasons. Then, when I realized that Iran was undertaking a massive restructuring of the state system, I determined to study it as a political scientist and urbanist. Then I was drawn as an expert assisting the attempt to introduce democratic local institutions. And then I became an activist actively promoting democracy and human rights. The book uses both the subjective and objective voices to tell the full story about the range of different roles that I played. Only the reader can decide how successful that strategy has been when it emerges in the covers of a scholarly book. Second, the book is a case study of a 30-year experiment in political decentralization under the Islamic Republic of Iran. However, I place this case study in the context of what has been called a worldwide decentralization revolution that started in the 1980s and arguably continues today. This idea, promoted by international organizations such as the UN and the World Bank, asserts that properly designed decentralization of the political, administrative, and fiscal dimensions of government policy could improve the ability of states everywhere to deliver better services to local populations, create more responsive institutions, and promote economic development, local economic development. I touched briefly on the cases of China, Indonesia, and some other countries, to show that Iran's trajectory was unique despite taking place about the same time and in the same global context. A third organizing idea in the book, maybe the key organizing idea, is the exploration of what I call the decentralization, democratization nexus. As someone who began his professional and academic career in the West, in fact, in New York City in 1984, when I emigrated to New York City, and I started working for community organizations in Brooklyn and in other parts of New York City, working on community-based development and other kinds of urban policy issues. I became fascinated by what seemed to me to become the localist tradition in what I call the localist tradition in democratic theory and practice entering into Iran. As I explained in the book, this wasn't just a theoretical issue. The reformers that I discuss explicitly invoked this localist tradition in democratic theory and practice to organize their platforms and their strategy and their policies. What do I mean by this localist tradition? A venerable tradition in Western political thought, famously represented in the writings of Alexis de Tocqueville and John Stuart Mill, contends that people's participation in local voluntary associations are intrinsically valuable means of enhancing the virtues and the dispositions necessary for liberal citizenship. In this view, cities are schoolhouses of democracy. Town meetings, this is another quote, town meetings are to liberty what primary schools are to science, said de Tocqueville. Another quote, in democratic countries, the science of association is the mother of science. And for de Tocqueville, the ability of people to get together, associate voluntarily, and influence the policies of their government in their local areas, for him was a key component of what would then grow into become democratic citizenship. John Stuart Mill said, for example, in his considerations on representative government, quote, representative sub-parliaments for local affairs must henceforth be considered as one of the fundamental institutions of a free government. Why? Because it involves individuals in running affairs, their affairs, between the 4 years of electing representatives to national governments. The reformers saw such possibilities in municipal institutions that they wanted to establish, that they did establish, and followed what can be called the Tocquevillian strategy. That is to say, they were going to empower civil society through local municipal institutions as a way of democratizing the larger polity in Iran. Going beyond the questions of merely administrative efficiency, technocracy, and departing from their earlier leftist orientations, these Islamic reformists, or what I call in the book the Muslim Democrats, posited that local political participation had intrinsic value in enhancing the project of strengthening civil society and democratic citizenship. The book looks critically at the application of this model and its assumptions. This is related, finally, to the question of democracy and how I deal with it in the book. One of the puzzles the book seeks to explain, and I was confronted in 1998 when I realized that the Islamic Republic was going to embrace all the factions, even the hardliner regime, were embracing this reform to expand the electoral machinery overnight from a restricted set of national institutions to embrace suddenly tens of thousands of elected councils in cities and villages around the country. The puzzle was, why would an anti-democratic, anti-liberal, theocratic regime do this? The puzzle is because for an authoritarian regime that wants to control the political institutions, expanding and diluting through these institutions can pose a hazard to their potential control, because it gives opponents potential bases to mobilize and to use against the central regime. So this was a puzzle. To answer this puzzle, I did two things around, I needed to, I took two directions around the question of elections and democracy. One, on how to define democracy, and two, how to relate elections to what I understood from the Western tradition as democratic theory, or democratic practice. I'm not going to go into in details. I'll just flag that conceptually, I found that the most effective definition, working definition of democracy was what I found to be the minimalist, what political scientists and political theorists called the minimalist theory of democracy. It's somewhat counterintuitive, but it is very straightforward. In the West, we typically understand democracy as meaning a system in which all good things go together. If you have free and fair elections, you have many other things that come along with it, like responsive government, even accountable government, and even other kinds of benefits such as economic growth, or let's say even increased trust within society. What I found is that that wasn't useful as a way to research and understand this new institution or this expansion of electoral institutions, because it put too many things inside the definition of democracy. Instead, I found it was most useful to make democracy here to mean merely the election of representatives, ideally through free and fair contested elections and with some basic preconditions. And then to use that to see whether any of these other ancillary benefits actually flowed from it. So yes, there was a level of democratization merely to mean institutions that previously were not elected, but were appointed by unelected, let's say, politicians, or not accountable in any direct way to an electoral constituency. To take that and to say, now that has been this transformation, let's look empirically and see what has been the impact on society. Has, in fact, introducing elections where there weren't before led to these purported or hypothesized benefits that de Tocqueville and Mill and others suggested might flow from that. I should say my findings and conclusions over 20 years of practice and looking at this were not particularly sanguine. I should say I've always continued to look at local politics in New York City and in the West. And I can just mention here that I wrote an article recently comparing the local elections in New York City and in Tehran last year. Interestingly, both had extremely low turnouts of less than 25%, in some areas below 20%. So obviously, if you're looking for elections being the independent variable and the sort of dependent variable being increased participation and interest, well, it's obviously not happening in a place like New York City, where there are those liberal preconditions compared to Iran. So this was a puzzle. And so that was one issue. The second way I handled the question of democracy was through I finally found a way to explain this puzzle, or help to explain this puzzle, was through a model that political scientists have developed called electoral authoritarianism. This model of electoral authoritarianism was something of a kind of innovation 20 years ago, but now it's not, unfortunately, because what we found is many countries around the world, authoritarian states, are extremely adept at using elections as a way of consolidating their authoritarian power and rule. So rather than elections always posing a challenge to authoritarian rule, I found that this was a way of, Iran was a case of electoral authoritarianism at the local level, as it is at the national level too. Finally, a point, and I'll conclude on this, finally a point about cities and how this interrelated with cities. I look at local governments and the way in which local governments can or cannot be democratic. That is to say, responsive and accountable to a local constituency. That's my working definition of a local democracy. Are local institutions responsive to the policy desires and interests of the people of that city? And are the policies that come out of that local government accountable to that constituency, in the sense that do constituencies engage really with do they evaluate the performance of their government so closely to be able to then make an informed decision the next round to vote them in or out or to modify? So even in this area, I found great evidence to suggest that people, even in, and I compare New York City here, I mean, even in a place like New York City, the degree of disengagement, the degree of what political scientists call political ignorance or rational political ignorance is much higher than you would expect or you would want if you're seeking to promote local democracy. So where do cities come in here? Cities come in here where I make three distinctions about how individuals who live in a city can impact their city. Going into this, and I summarize this in sort of three headlines as foot voting, ballot voting, and talking. In fact, I do it the other way. It's sort of talking, ballot voting, and foot voting. The traditional idea around the Tocquevillian idea, and we know this from the American tradition of town hall meetings, is that in fact cities are places where democratic deliberation should happen most. And when political theorists talk about deliberation as being central to democratic practice, essentially this means people talking, getting together, talking, and getting to some kind of consensus. My question was empirically, does this actually happen in cities? Does it actually happen in Tehran? Does it actually happen in New York City? I always use this as a sort of reference point. The second model for local democracy is ballot voting, which is our traditional model. People every 4 years go to go to some place and they drop a piece of paper or press a button and they decide through an aggregation of individuals' votes what the decision should be, who should rule in their name. Since I don't find either of these two as operating very strongly in Tehran, I don't find it operating extremely strongly in the West that much, it's certainly not deliberation, ballot voting does happen. There is a third mechanism in which ordinary individuals impact their city, the shape of the city, and also potentially impact the way in which the local governments can react. And that is through foot voting. Because in fact, most cities are made through the migration, the voluntary migration of individuals, usually from rural areas to the city. And ultimately, the threat of exit of those individuals out of the city. So these are the three mechanisms. And the argument is that competition between local governments and cities puts pressure on local governments to react to what their constituents want, separate from whether those constituents are talking or they're ballot voting. This is the real mechanism of the market pressing how cities and local governments work, ideally. And so I end up with what I call a urbanism without romance. And this is a reference to a famous comment about what is public choice theory by a well-known public choice theorist, James Buchanan, who talked about politics without romance. I'm referring to urbanism without romance. It's really about what local governments can do to maximize local democracy is to create the conditions for people to live where they want, work where they want, and to move between them, and also to move in and out. So I don't say we should have only one of these mechanisms, but I do find in the Tehran case and in other cases that these three mechanisms work together to create this. So these are some of the points that I had. I'm sorry I went on a bit longer than I anticipated, and I look forward to the comments of the panelists. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Let me start by saying I absolutely love this book, and I recommend that all of you read it, those of you who haven't already. And let me thank Reinhold for the introduction and Kian for the invitation to reflect a little on the book and the arguments in it. A bit more background of why I might be a worthwhile person to listen to about whether this book is any good. For the last 6 or 7 years, I've been teaching a course at SIPA called Authoritarianism, the politics of policymaking in non-democratic settings. So much of what he describes, I'm going to be assigning next semester. But the part of the reason why I have been interested in that is between the time when I was dean and when I developed that course, I served for about 8 years in Egypt as the president of the American University in Cairo during the uprisings and so forth. So I've been interested in these sort of very large, very complicated, non-democratic settings for a while. And so I bring that perspective to the book. But I also bring a kind of profoundly American Tocquevillian, why don't we all get together and get along view of the world. And it's interesting because as you talk about New York City and participation in New York City, I come from a small town in the United States where within the next couple of weeks, we will be voting for the school board budget, we will be voting for the village mayor, and we will be considering a budget for the volunteer fire department. That's Tocqueville. And it still exists in this country. And one of the things that I remember being quite struck about was talking to the then Egyptian ambassador to the United States, now the foreign minister, who said that he thought one of the most astonishing things in the United States when he got here was the volunteer fire department, which is true. So there is a political culture in the United States, which really infuses a lot of the way we think about politics and the way we think about the world and the democracy promotion and so forth and so on. Even if in most of the lived experience of Americans, it's not really true anymore. Certainly it was, these small towns exist, but it's become part of our own self-image, our own sense of, I don't know how many fire departments in this country are volunteer anymore, but boy, we think they are. So there's a real kind of conviction about how we live and what a desirable life is and so forth and so on. That's very wrapped up in that kind of sense that what I think is actually, and one thing I'd love to talk about later is the issue of scale. That you can do things in small towns that you can't do in cities, and to what extent does that make any difference in how we understand some of this stuff? In any event, this book is a remarkable mix, as has been observed already, of the personal and the professional, from memoir to spreadsheet, in a really interesting way. I think that's very successful. It gives life to the spreadsheet, if you will. And there is a lot of data here that's particularly interesting, but it's presented in a way that has a vitality to it that's pretty unusual. And an effort to assess what decentralization meant to its various advocates and then what they actually accomplished. So I think Kian's capacity to reminisce about his time in the country when he had returned as a student and a planner and an expert and an activist and ultimately a political prisoner, does give life to what is sometimes a pretty dry, data-heavy analysis. And as he suggests, this wave of enthusiasm for decentralization was quite widespread in the world. And this is what, the World Bank was telling everybody they should do and so forth and so on at about this time. And of course, the World Bank wasn't telling Iran what to do, but Iran can read. So that's sort of what was stylish in the world. And this, to me, accompanied or certainly was correlated with the great enthusiasm for democracy after the end of the Cold War. So democracy promotion efforts that took the end of the Cold War democracy promotion and then the post 9/11 democracy promotion, somewhat different, but nonetheless democracy promotion on the part of the United States, particularly. So Clinton had a version of that and Bush had a version of that, but it was democracy promotion. In some ways, intersected with the Tocquevillian, conviction that, if you can see yourself ruling yourself and so forth and so on, that will be more democratic. So decentralization, I think, was in fact linked in certain ways with this idea. And this is why I ever talked to the Egyptian ambassador. I said, Egypt would be much better if the little towns and villages actually could, elect their own mayors instead of you in Cairo appointing all the mayors. So it was very much that same, in retrospect, I think that was naive on my part, but it was an interesting conversation. In any event, I do think those two things were linked in the policy world and therefore linked in some ways in all of the debates about the value of decentralization. And just as democracy came to be the solution to everything, so, it was the solution. I mean, there are wonderful quotes from the democracy promotion people so democracies go to war with each other, so it's good for peace. That was the 1990s. And then no democracies export terrorism. So that was the argument in the aughts and so forth and so on. It does everything. It's just sort of the solution to whatever problem you come up with. The solution is democracy. And I would argue that in a sense, decentralization was a version of that. So Egyptians should decentralize, Libyans should decentralize, you know, name a country, it would be better off. Because, you know, it became something that the policy folks in the international organizations didn't have to think very much. They just pulled it off the shelf and said, this is the solution. So what's really interesting here is that this is a case where it wasn't quite pulled off the same shelf, but it had some of the same underlying convictions. And Kian argues that the democratization of the electoral and political dimensions of local government were promoted by the reformists that he describes. And that was one of the rationales. Then there was also a rationale that it would strengthen the administrative functions, the administrative capacity. So there you get your technocrats. And the third group was this would be a way of Islamizing public institutions by promoting ruling. So you had, as he points out, three quite different rationales for why this would be beneficial. And in part, the failure of the decentralization efforts to produce democracy was a function of the fact that at least two of the groups that advocated decentralization weren't really serious about democracy. That's not why they thought it would be a good idea. And so those people who did think decentralization would produce democracy were defeated. Now, they were also obviously defeated because things changed on the national and international change in Iran and so forth. But in some respects, I think he makes a pretty strong case that they were defeated because their erstwhile collaborators did not anticipate democracy as an outcome here. They anticipated some of the other, in fact, outcomes. So then the question is, what were some of the ways that decentralization diverged from this democratic, you know, the expectation that it would end up democratic? And he describes a number of these, some of which are well known to anyone who studies Iran at the national level. The idea of disqualifying candidates so that by the time you have the people who can run for election, they're already with ruling authorities' programs. And certainly that's, you know, makes for an illiberal democracy or electoral authoritarianism. One of the things I thought might be fun to do with this idea of Islamic participatory governance, which is the way the ruling authorities were describing what this was going to be, is to think almost beyond the electoral authoritarianism to the real old stuff about totalitarian participation. You know, this is literature we haven't used in a really long time, but when we were trying to think about why it was that the Soviet Union was trying to get everybody involved in politics all the time, it wasn't because they actually wanted them to be involved in politics. They wanted opportunities to propagandize. And this was a mechanism for that. And I actually sort of heard a little bit of a resonance of that. It's a different literature, it's a different era, but, you know, and nobody says countries are totalitarian anymore, but you know, you can have totalitarian aspirations if you're a government because you want to, you know, have this sort of mobilization. So it's like a mobilization. So I thought that was quite striking, actually. What I thought was most interesting in some ways was the chapter on what Kian calls financing local democracy, which was really about, you know, the old relationship between taxation and representation. Not the way he frames it, but the way I would frame it, because I'm still coming at this as if it was those sorts of relationships. So he developed a really wonderful, remarkable data set based on audited financial statements from a bunch of municipalities. I mean, it's really clever methodology here in order to see where the revenues of these localities were coming from, because presumably one of the things you want to be able to do if you're elected is be able to fund things. So where are you going to get the resources to fund whatever it is that you're voters, your constituents, had wanted. Well, as it turns out, as you might expect when you think about it a little bit, they were very, very constrained in their capacity to set taxes, raise taxes, or otherwise develop their own revenue streams. So that's not that surprising, actually. That's pretty typical of a sort of not decentralized system. What's not decentralized is the money. You know, and you have to follow the money. Otherwise, this whole thing doesn't work. So the local school board elections that I described before and the budget there is because the taxes of the people who are voting are going to go to pay for the schools. So people can see a very direct relationship. If your school funding is coming from Tehran, then whatever the people who are supposed to be in charge of the local schools say, who cares? You really don't have any. So to break that means that the central government, however much they pay lip service to these kinds of elections and local things and so forth and so on, aren't really serious about it. And so until localities can manage their own taxes and so forth, much more than it appears that anybody could in these cases in any event. And moreover, when they were able to raise revenues, such as by issuing construction permits and things like that, that, of course, you realize distorts incentives all sorts of ways and makes for public policy that's really driven by real estate. And here we are back in New York, public policy driven by real estate, but in a different sort of way. But the point is, it's you know, the discussion, that particular chapter, but running through it, the discussion of the finances and how that changes the politics and distorts policy incentives and so forth, I thought was particularly interesting. So a couple more general comments and then I'm finished. I hope I have incentivized all of you to read the book. It's suggested to me that this discussion, particularly of the financial side, that decentralization so understood or designed, that is to say, without decentralizing revenue streams as well, may be a part of the story of the conditions of unplanned growth that we see in so many cities in the global South. It's not, in other words, simply a reflection of what a great urbanist said of Cairo, that it was a city out of control. But in fact, it's a city where local authorities use things like construction permits to fund whatever they want to do. And so you see these very strange configurations of policy in these places. It would certainly be worth looking at the financing of city government around the world to try and figure out how much autonomy they have and how the financing sources change their policies. And finally, since we are talking today about this, the appropriation of institutional forms like elections, parties, local government, and decentralization that are associated with democratic participation by autocrats seems to both permit control. They can control what people are doing by managing these managed elections, and to invite disillusionment. And so I really think one of the things that all of us who have seen these experiments should be thinking about is that ultimately those who are disqualified, either formally because they're not allowed to run for election because they don't qualify as acceptable candidates, or because they simply feel disenfranchised by that system, and those who are unable to pay for services they want, not because they can't afford to, but because they aren't allowed to. So that's that strange finance disincentive. Though those people are likely to vote, as Kian says, as it were, with their feet. And I don't think that's just migration. I think that's going out and protest. And you're going to see this happening over and over again in places where you have these fraudulent democratic gestures, because they're frustrating. They convey the idea that you should be able to participate and then prevent you from doing so. And that just is not a stable equilibrium. So I think that's one of the things that we might want to talk about later if I haven't taken up too much time already. Thank you.
In the last few years, there have been at least 7 major academic works on the question of democracy, the problems of democracy, the obstacles to democracy in Iran since 1979. If one looks at these books, I would say by far the most thorough, the most empirical, the most innovative work is Kian's work here. It's not only dealing with local politics, which he stressed, but I think it's also very much dealing on the national level of what the problems of democracy. So a few minutes I have, I don't want to go further into the micro level. I want to actually give a sort of a larger macro level. I know he dealt on some macro level on the international questions of pressures for decentralization. But I think for Iran, there is another micro level that's useful to look at, which is a Foucaultian analysis of Iranian politics. Foucault in Iran is very popular because at the height of the revolution, he parachuted into the country and wrote some nice things about the revolution, knowing nothing about the revolution. But if you actually apply Foucaultian discourse analysis, you can see a lot of things that was going on in Iran and is actually going on in Iran right now with the protests. If you look at Iranian history from beginning of the 20th century to about the 1960s, the prevalent discourse was that of the French Enlightenment, especially of the French Revolution. The issues that were people discussing were basically questions of liberty, equality, and natural rights, and of course, secularism. And this was very much the dominant paradigm of language from 1906 to the 1960s. So even all the major, I would say, figures of that time, Mossadegh, Khuda Bahar, Taqizadeh Davar, they all subscribed to this French Enlightenment discourse. Even the ones that supported Reza Shah still subscribed to it because from their point of view, Reza Shah was building a state, and you need a state to be able to basically secure these individual rights. Just to give you an example, a surprising example, if you look at the Tudeh Party, the Communist Party program in the early 1940s, the very second clause of the program states, "We struggle for the establishment of a democratic regime and securing of full individual and social rights, especially the rights of language, speech, pen, thought, and assembly." So I would say this is the core of the French Enlightenment. It was very much there in Iran at this period. What shifts very much is in the 60s, the coming of the discourse of Gharb Zadagi, which is often translated as Western struckedness, but I prefer to call it the plague from the West. In fact, Al-Ahmad, who really popularized this notion, has the image of Camus' plague from the West. And what he does in a brilliant writing style, basically traces all the things he dislikes about his contemporary Iran to basically the West. So among the long list he has, you can get is crime, alienation, consumerism, pessimism, selfishness, fatalism, effeminacy, bad architecture, and believe it or not, even the Mongol invasions are basically linked to Gharb Zadagi. So this type of discourse, for reasons I won't go into, becomes dominant by the 70s. It becomes so dominant that even Islamist reformists, fundamentalists, Islamic radicals, and of course, it's even some, I would say, simple-minded leftists subscribe to this. And even the court begins to adopt this language. So if you look at court intellectuals like Fardid, Naraghi, Nasr, they all basically talk about how the West is so bad. We don't want anything from the West. We should look towards our own roots, our own sources, our own culture. And of course, Islam then becomes very important for them. For the more monarchists, it becomes 2,500 years of history. But what they all have in common is they object to this notion of individual rights, of natural rights. So you can have under Islam certain responsibilities, and if you have rights, they come from God. They're not something that from nature, it's intrinsic to yourself. And of course, the idea of secularism is then considered unacceptable because it's a Western idea. So when the Islamic Revolution comes, it's very much then formulated and institutionalized into the notion of velayat al-faqih. The authority of the jurist becomes predominant. And a lot of Islamicists at first said, well, we're using Islam as a sort of way of rallying, mobilizing people, thinking it's a sort of, Islam is like a supermarket. You can go in to pick the things you want and then check out and leave the things, of course, you don't want behind. Of course, religion, Islam, like any other religion, has its own discourse, it has its own parameters, it has its own premises. And once you enter that discourse, you're actually entering a straitjacket. And the people who control that straitjacket are the experts on religion. So it's just because you're a sociologist from the Sorbonne doesn't mean you can interpret, say, this is true Islam. Well, someone who spent their whole lifetime in the seminaries in Rome will say, no, you're wrong, and this is true Islam. Obviously, the guy who spent a whole lifetime in the seminary is more equipped to decide what true Islam is rather than having studied sociology in the Sorbonne. So not surprisingly, after the revolution, the constitution that was established, and this becomes a very much constraining power on any form of democracy, is the power of the ulama, the clerical power, headed, of course, by whoever would be the leading cleric. Some people, as I think Kian mentioned, some people talk about the constitution as a hybrid system of Islamic authority and a democracy or republicanism. It's not. It's much more of a clerical establishment with a few trappings of participation as a lip service to democracy. When the document was drawn up, actually, there's one perceptive commentator said this was a transitional stage, in a way like socialism was a transitional stage to communism. The Islamic constitution was a transitional stage eventually to an emirate, where the trappings of participation can be eliminated, but you would have still God's representative, the emir, who would be then controlling the state. So in the early period, the participation voting was very important. That's why there was some actually choice between candidates. You could get 80% participation in an election. That has disappeared, not accidentally, because I think the people who are in charge are not that concerned about participation. What they want is, for their point of view, they represent God. and everything else is basically subsidiary to it. So if you have even little participation and eventually you get rid of elections, you still have an Islamic state rather than an Islamic republic. Here I would say there's a difference between totalitarianism, Elisa mentioned, and Islamic authoritarianism. In the communist authoritarianism, legitimacy resided in the people, however much that was distorted and controlled. It was, after all, a Soviet. What was a Soviet? The Soviet was originally elected bodies before the revolution. In the Islamic system, authority, legitimacy doesn't come from the people, it comes from God. So if there is any elections, that's peripheral to it. Essential is the authority from God. So this makes it a very different situation where they can, in fact, from their point of view, dispense with the trappings of democracy because their authority comes from above, from on high. Now, what you're seeing now, I think, is, in fact, decline of this Gharbzadegi discourse and return back to the Enlightenment discourse. So a lot of the reformers who are basically rediscovering the benefits of democracy are, in fact, reinventing the wheel. They don't want to go back and quote De Khuda or people like that from the earlier period. So they're acting as if they're rediscovering benefits of democracy based on individual rights. But this is what they are actually doing, implicitly doing, is going back to the earlier period without admitting it and trying to say they are, in fact, rediscovering a new form of politics. So the youth now, you find, demonstrating may not have read the French philosophers. Some of them have, but many of them not. But instinctively, I think what they're talking about is basically individual rights, that they have the choice whether to wear the hijab or not, what music they should listen to, what books they should read, and of course, rights such as to vote, to write whatever they want. These are basic, instructed rights that they feel belongs to them without having to have, let's say, the intellectual equipment to justify. And this is, of course, surprising because these kids are graduates or products of the Islamic Republic. They went to Islamic primary school, Islamic secondary school, Islamic colleges. So you would expect they would be basically products and advocates of the Islamic system. Yet I think instinctively, and here there's a question of human instinct, they have this idea that they are best to judge on what they want to do. They don't want the state, especially some old man with a beard, telling them what to do. And here I would differ with Kian, and he makes a remark that Westerners harbor enlightened presumptions that there are such universal desires as pluralism, individualism, liberty. I would say these are Western premises. These are Enlightenment premises. They're not general Western premises. The counter Enlightenment certainly didn't accept it. Many religious people in the West still don't accept it. But these are, I would say, French Enlightenment premises that actually fit with human instincts. And what the new generation is doing is, in fact, going back to what existed in Iranian history, mainly because it does fit into human instinct. That doesn't mean all people, all Iranians subscribe to it. But what you see very much since, I would say, the 1980s, is very much disenchantment with the whole idea of Gharbzadegi. And disenchantment has led people back to rediscovering the benefits of the Enlightenment. So I would say that because I would say there's still people in Iran that subscribe to the notions of Velayat al-Faqih, but they become less and less. This conflict that exists between these two discourses, you can even call it a cultural conflict, will be an ongoing conflict. There's not something going to end, even if the regime survives this. It will, more and more people, especially of younger generation, are going to be opposed to that whole notion of religious state. And doing so, they basically gravitate to the notions of the French Enlightenment. So in a way, we're back to history, back to the past, but often the past never leaves us. So I'll just stop there.
Wait, you hear us? Okay, there you go.
Yeah, thank you. Kian, for this terrific book and for including me in this discussion. I am really just a scholar of cities and in a comparative context. So I think reading your book has been a really great learning experience. I actually read cover to cover, but I think in the interest of time and also, my limited understanding of the country, as well as some of the key themes in your book, I will maybe focus my thoughts in three large themes only, but do raise some questions for you. So first is this you call the decentralization and democracy nexus. And I find that really fascinating. As a student of decentralization, I have tracked quite a bit of the writings and the happenings since the late, since the 80s and 90s and certainly onwards. And you very much point out that within decentralization, there's the physical decentralization, administrative, and then political decentralization, at least, the different forms. And you make the argument that in Iran, political decentralization was serving a purpose actually to strengthen concentration of power. And I couldn't agree more, right? So if we look at the rationale for decentralization from the beginning and or among many nation states, for some, it was a matter of making sure the public sector performed better or met the needs of the citizenry more clearly. So it really, in a way, paralleled efforts of privatization, right? So if you look at a lot of studies of the 80s and 90s, decentralization was about administrative and public sector efficiency. And there, I think you're not seeing the kind of the incentives and motivations that are provided through sort of the democratic movements that we have been seeing more recently, in the Arab Springs and also in the more, perhaps that we could call the more successful nation states that have democratized in the last few decades. If you look at South Korea, Taiwan, right? And so decentralization really conceptually and in its practice can be quite detached from democratization. And we may have a state that's highly decentralized in terms of fiscal affairs, but very much Unitarian state in terms of political control. We can, China is an example in some ways, Indonesia is another example. So here I was really thinking about, as reading your book, about, so why are some countries using decentralization or through decentralization have achieved undemocratic goals, or while others are merely using decentralization as a way of distribute responsibilities for providing for the citizenry. And so it comes to mind is the question of democratic institutions. So I was really trying to look in your book the kind of long-standing democratic institutions that might have been built in the experiment, or you would say the effort among the, especially the reformists, right? And even, especially and currently, our own country here, we're really concerned about the future of democracy. We're looking at why there is so little, in a sense, that we can do to stop certain, anti-democratic practices. And then that's also another kind of practice across in Latin America. Certain countries are looking at rewriting their constitution. So that's one form of democratic institution. And then, so the party rules and how local and national elections may happen in sync or not. There's been a lot of research done that you mentioned that also local elections have very low turnout. And that's been clearly demonstrated. That's because only when national elections happen at the same time as local elections, you have decent turnout for. And so how do we think about democratic institutions through either bottom-up or top-down movements that really allow democratic kind of elements to take root in the society? It's a question that I've been sort of looking for answers in your book, and also been thinking about places like Taiwan and South Korea and how they have done that in a fairly short amount of time, a few decades. But on the other hand, we are observing, the countries that have gone through Arab Spring, that very, very encouraging movements, but we're still waiting to see the more encouraging outcomes here. And so related to that, my second thought was how you positioned the planners, the urban policymakers in this flux, right? In this power and political flux. And as someone who studies urban planning, I think especially if we look at planning in its top-down master plan and comprehensive plan types of traditional approach, I think inevitably we're looking at planning as an apparatus of the dominating regime. And that we have seen that in many places, in many countries, right? Again, I know China better and other East Asian countries a little bit more than I know anything about Iran. And there we've seen that planning is placed in a very uncomfortable position, right? Because they are subject, planners, as well as planning institutions are subject to the regime dominance. And planning inevitably is embedded in the politics of the dominant regime. And I think, so the profession of planning has been retrospective and introspective of the role of planners and planning in terms of instituting and or facilitating state violence. And that's inevitable because planning in many what we call unitarian states are part of the state. And so in a way that's very difficult to be looked at or seen as a somewhat independent or autonomous decision maker or decision-making entity. And we have seen throughout planning's history, both especially in practice, that the field, the profession has tried to sort of negotiate its connection with politics, right? We've seen the tendency of being more technocratic, which you also kind of argue that the technocrats in Iran kind of sided with the Islamists. And I'm not sure they have any other choice in the sense of their subjugation to the regime. And then we also have seen even city management forms, say in the United States, moving away as part of the politics precisely for the likely outcome that maybe city management can be more autonomous. And then we have seen, especially in the west part of the United States, some success of this more independent urban management model, although with the more recent injection and influx of diverse populations, that's being challenged as well. And so the last bit I wanted to kind of share with you is I find it really fascinating as I was reading through the book, and even though it's in Iran's place I know very little about, I kept saying, oh my gosh, this is something that I've seen in other contexts and so on. And I find what you have presented on many issues are very emblematic of other contexts and or developments that are occurring in other countries. For instance, the ways in which you are looking at the local city councils being very limited in power, although it's been highly attractive to various different kind of constituencies. And I can immediately think about village elections in China, right? It's been very much bottom up and really encouraging force, but it's been tolerated. And it's, now we hear less about it, but it's been tolerated precisely because it's actually outside of the main, what we call nomenclature. So anybody who's been elected would not have any political future of moving upwards, right? So it's, you talked about accountability upwards or downwards. And so I think even when we have a unitarian state that is very much top down, I think these democratic movements can coexist as long as they do not challenge the legitimacy and the control of the dominant regime. And so I think that's something that I'm not sure that we'll see will automatically or naturally turn into a democratic kind of momentum for that country to take advantage of. And then last but not least, you talk about, so I wanted to concur with Lisa that the physical situation that you identified with Tehran and other cities is exactly like many other global South countries where the cities are very much constrained in terms of revenue responsibilities, but are endowed with excessive, what we call expenditure responsibilities. And so in a way that they have to, the smaller cities, as you described, are much more reliant on the central government in providing for services. The big city, Tehran, has much more autonomy. And this is very similar across many global South countries. And there, we understand that resources have to follow power decentralization. And in many countries, that is not the case. On the other hand, I'm not sure that we can say that that concurrence would actually be a panacea, because we also have seen, for instance, in Brazil and some other countries where local governments have much more autonomy in terms of public finance. We also have been seeing, tremendous amount of what we call subnational debts because of the sort of exploitative behaviors of international banks to really pile on subnational governments. So I think overall, I feel like this book is of great interest to scholars and students, not only of interest, interested in Iran, but really to think about how democratic movements and decentralization efforts and urban governance are all kind of entangled, intertwined in this kind of complex history that you've presented. So we really very much enjoyed it.
All right, so you got all that?
Yeah.
Yeah? We do have time for you to process and respond in some synthetic fashion. Well, these amazing.
Well, yeah.
And then maybe also just to.
Yeah, just very briefly. I mean, first of all, thank you very much to Lisa, Ervand, and Wei Ping for these wonderful comments. I'll just touch on some of the points that I think I'd like to flag and think about as in the future. Lisa, you mentioned totalitarian participation. I think that I would concur. I moved gingerly on that, as you can understand, but there were times I didn't, when I essentially said, look, if you want to understand the Iranian regime's model, it's the Bolshevik model. So I wasn't pulling any punches there, I guess. There was this whole Bolshevik theory about how you had local Soviets as being the transition sort of cogs or something into the thing. So, I mean, I think, but the idea of thinking about Islamic participatory governance within the framework of the older literature like Juan Lintz and stuff, that is something I will think about more. I mean, I think that's right. I mean, I think we could do that. Although, I do have the sense, though, that there was something sui generis about the way the Islamists do think. I mean, it was a puzzle. If it's true that there's a sort of totalitarian motivation to mobilize, but there was something sort of intuitively seemed to be sui generis about the way the Islamists sort of said, the way I put it in terms of a sort of an ideal Islamic subject is one that has these Islamic virtues as a public servant, which is, I'm not sure I would find that in the totalitarian mobilization literature, but it's certainly worth thinking about. So, I mean, that's very interesting. Another point you mentioned about foot voting as can it be expressed in protest? I guess in my other writings, which are more recent, I have tried to separate out these different modalities of reaction. So foot voting, I want as an urbanist to say that there is something about the mobility, the market mechanism that imposes constraints on cities, on local governments that's the hypothesis. So, DeSantis recently, in his famous speech, he made a lot of comparisons about this is, Florida does this, New York does this, and it does it so much worse. Come to Florida. And that New York City is losing population, and so on and so forth. So the hypothesis is that, and this goes to one thing that Wei Ping said about, where are the democratic roots? Again, I wanted to think beyond ballot voting. Because ballot voting it is a now standard finding in Western and certainly American political science that turnout for local elections is always lower than national elections now. And so that kind of defeats, I mean, I think de Tocqueville would be surprised. I mean, he would say, why? but it is a standard result. It's much, much lower. And it's so low at times that one begins.
Not for the school board.
Well, I think
Anyway,
maybe not in your town, but but I think nationwide the data is so. I mean, I guess I would put protest as a kind of in a sense, if people cannot move, that's when voice comes in. So actually, if people could move from Tehran, let's say, and go to another city where they're treated better, where the local police, let's say, are more under the control of the local city council, or that they had more say, or they felt that they could have an influence on public space, they will move. Now, I'm not too sanguine about that mechanism, because even in the West, it's what's called the Tibu hypothesis among economists, but it doesn't always sort of pan out that way. It's very hard to move and so forth, but it still does happen. So I would separate foot voting from protest for that particular reason. Ervand, yeah, I mean, I'm not going to disagree with you about the roots of this of these ideas about individual freedom and so forth, and personal autonomy and collective sovereignty. But I guess it could be just a semantic quibble. It's because I was researching the dominant discourse in Iran. You know, they frame something that comes from the French Enlightenment as coming from the French Enlightenment. I mean, you called it the French Enlightenment, so they would say it's from France. Now, you know, this is an old debate within social science. I mean, Weber speculated, why is it that the West claims that its ideas are universal? And so the idea of a Western claim for universality gets into this kind of a circular issue. But certainly if there's a group in the world that rejects the universality of a Western theory, they rejected it, and therefore it's not universal. It has to be accepted as universal. And so I don't disagree with you in that sense, and your general thesis that there's a disenchantment with Khabzadegi, with anti-Westernism, yeah, I think that's true, and I think we're seeing that. I mentioned, I mean, you did mention the issue of the culture clash. I wrote this in my essay about the protests, about the called the First Feminist Uprising, was published in Public Seminar 2 weeks ago, and this was a point I made on the BBC when I was interviewed on the BBC World Service. I made the point that even if the government in Iran is overthrown, but you're still going to have, this isn't going to solve the problem, because you're going to still have a culture clash among millions of Iranians who, frankly detest the protesters and support the regime. They're not going to go away. They're not going to emigrate. But so what you have is, so I completely concur with this idea of a culture clash as something that is an ongoing challenge. Wei Ping, thank you for raising a number of questions, and some of them I will have to think about and think more deeply about. You posed the question, why do certain countries use decentralization to deepen democracy while others use it just to increase efficiency? I mean, I think that is absolutely the core question of a comparative analysis. And it is, and I'll give you the example. For example, I mean, I have these three examples: Iran, Indonesia, and China. So China has been the most successful case of using fiscal decentralization and some administrative decentralization to achieve a goal. And that goal was economic growth. And by Chinese economists and scholars basically say, they do point that the greatest economic miracle in the history of mankind, which has been China over the last 3 decades, can be traced primarily to the way it empowered local governments to essentially trade land and give them the authority over land. But There's no political decentralization in China. They're completely appointed. They're completely subordinate to higher levels of the bureaucracy. And so my answer to, but in Indonesia, why were local elections part of a broader democratic experiment? The reason is because the 1998, am I right, 1998 or 99 Reformasi movement in Indonesia was based on a pluralization and liberalization of the Marcos regime. It was part and parcel of this broader democratizing of the entire national polity, whereas there was no such thing going on in China, obviously, and interestingly, there was no such thing going on in Iran. So one of the things in the book, and as a social science researcher, I should say, I made this discovery in the book, which was that it's nice to make a discovery, it's like when you do research, which was that, the conventional view was that the local councils was the initiative of the democratic reformists. Turns out it wasn't. It turns out it was a law put into place by the hardline parliament 5 years before they were in power, and they just implemented it. And so there was a whole set of questions about, well, what were the hardliners doing, introducing political decentralization? And I pegged that partly as just simply to increase a kind of little as a response to riots, urban riots, widespread urban riots. And so, so coming back to Wei Ping's question, I think it has to do with an overall program of democratization. In that case, subnational governments can be pulled into that. Although I do in the book discuss a wrinkle, which is that you can have a democratic polity which doesn't actually empower local governments. And I make the UK, England and the UK as a case of that. And I mean, if local governments in the UK don't have a lot of power, does that make the whole polity undemocratic? And I'd say no, and there are reasons why I do that. The question of where I place the urban planners, well, in Iran, I place them as part of the technocracy. They are hired by the government. They are government employees. They are bureaucrats. And I'm not even sure we can talk in Iran. You can't. It's very hard to talk about independent technocrats because they have to be paid and employed by the government. But even though there were some technocrats that when the reformists were in power, they did the bidding of the reformists. So in a sense, they are apolitical in that view. But one interesting thing about and this comes to your final point, Wei Ping, about the downsides of decentralization. I do try to point that out. That is to say, there's a lot of things that go wrong in decentralization. And it tended to be the technocrats who pointed that out. That is to say, the idea that you can create more efficient government by decentralizing to lower subnational units actually depends on a number of criteria. There are questions of efficiencies of scale, spillover effects, negative externalities, and also questions of elite capture. You have small places, you have, very powerful families, tribes, groups, ethnic groups. They can take over the local government and they can push everyone else out, and you don't have democracy in that way. So so thank you for raising those questions, and I will continue thinking about all the points that I haven't been able to address. Thank you.
All right, so we're a little over, but I have a feeling there are some questions.
Please.
Yeah, and so we'll see what we can do. Yeah.
To ask a question about the protests. I was just wondering, listening, not having read the books, for which I apologize, but I was just wondering, having heard your presentation, whether any of these, to call them social infrastructures of decentralization and / democratization, have intersected with the protesters. Have you seen formation of new leadership, for example? Have any of the political representatives of these elected political representatives joined the protests. And on the note related to the protests, I was struck that the protests take place in such a wide variety of places, from Mahsa Amini's gravesite to small towns, to rooftops, for instance. If you could talk about like the places where protests take place. And then also, I was wondering whether protests are now becoming less about anti-authoritarianism, although they're mostly about anti-authoritarianism, but are they also about issues of equality and social equality? Like, are they becoming more motivated by systemic changes?
Okay, I'll be very brief. Forgive me. Actually, the argument I make in the book is after the 20-year experiment. Okay, in other words, the first local elections in Iran were in 1999. The last ones were in 2019, I think. We've had 7 rounds. The story I tell in the book is a story of co-optation and integration of these local elections, these new political institutions, squarely within the control of the theocratic machinery, of the Velayat Faqih machinery that Ervan was talking about. So in a sense, I tell a sad story of essentially an early experiment that failed and that it was defeated, as Lisa summarized. And as a result, there really is no opportunity for these organs to be, there's very little opportunity for them to contribute or be actors in these protests. Although it's a really interesting question, and I'm going to actually look to see whether there are any things. But in general, no. The point of the book was that the local councils have been pretty squarely co-opted within the entire intergovernmental structure. And I guess the question about equality and authoritarianism, I can speak about it later with you. It's a little complicated. Yeah.
Any others? Yeah, I know, quite comprehensive, I have to say. There is an opportunity to continue the conversation, though, in the next room. So maybe that's our cue. Huh? Well, thank you again, all. Congratulations to Kian. And read the book, buy the book, read the book.